Welcome to a special edition of Daily Dose, and in this video we're going to, in a sense, double-click on an issue that has come up in our initial study of Genesis 6, the first 4 verses, which in fact are on the screen here from Codex Alexandrinus, regarding the gigantes, the giants. What's the deal with those folks, or the Nephilim, as we see in the Hebrew? So in this particular video, I want to get into a few of the particulars about some of the theories pertaining to these figures in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. So let's remind ourselves of what was taking place in Genesis 4 in particular. Hoide gigantes, eson, epites, geis, entes, hemerais, ekanais, kai met ekanon. So we've already read this. The key thing here is the giants that are present on earth in those days. And if you recall from an earlier video, I gave you the translation equivalents for this particular word. In the Masoretic, it's the Nephilim here. And so that's Nephilim. We also saw that Jerome translates the Nephilim as gigantes, and that's probably because he's partly influenced by the Septuagint here. It's the same word. Targum onkelos there is giveria, which is basically like a mighty warrior, something like that. You see something similar in the Syriac Peshitta. But Aquila takes it as hoi ek pipamptes, and that is a participle for someone who has fallen. Symmachus takes it as these mighty people, and some of the other Greek variants out there. One of them is hoi dunatoi, the mighty ones, or something along those lines. So what I'm going to try to get into in this particular video is some of the background behind the different theories pertaining to who exactly these figures are. You can see even in the translations, there's a big question as to what exactly is the Hebrew talking about. Now, a relevant point of context is the rest of the verse, because that's going to impact the trajectory of interpretation, especially in the Jewish community. And so, as we've already covered, the explanation in the Masoretic text for who these giants are, the gigantes, is they appear to be the result of the sons of God, the huioi tu theou, who are going into the daughters of man, the thugateros there, and are having children being born to them. And the writer here, Moses, says, and I think this is a good translation into the Greek, that those ones, the offspring, if you will, of the sons of God and these daughters of men, whatever that means, sons of God here and daughters of men, are precisely these giants. And so that has created this issue of, okay, there's a bit of an origin story here. There's not much there, but what's going on? And what we see is the early interpretive tradition is trying to fill in the gaps and explain who exactly these people are, because they are going to be relevant with the coming flood in Genesis chapter 6. The translational way of taking Nephilim kind of falls out into these three options, as we've already seen. Giants is one of them, as we see in the Septuagint and Jerome. Fallen ones, as we see in Aquila, and mighty ones with some of the other traditions. And what's interesting is that all three of these are actually relevant in the interpretive tradition, that giants is a key part of it, but there's a sense that whoever is bringing these people about are indeed fallen, as we'll see, but they're mighty, partly because they're giants, and so on. And when you look at the intertestamental writings, and actually potentially into early Christianity as well, there are, in essence, two main theories, two main interpretive traditions. One that is typically called the Watchers theory. And so, it even has its own, Wikipedia page. The other one I'm just going to call the offspring theory. There's not a great name for it, but I'll express what that is towards the end of the video. We're going to spend most of our time on the Watchers theory because I find it to be quite fascinating, and it is the most abundantly attested until you get into early Christianity. So let's begin with the Watchers theory. And I'm going to hit you with a handful of passages that capture this idea. And you may be wondering, why do I have Ethiopic in the background of the screen here? Because arguably the earliest interpretation is found in 1st Enoch, which is best preserved for us in the Ethiopic tradition, although there are Greek fragments of it as well. And so I've introduced 1st Enoch in other videos. It may be quite familiar, but let's just read an excerpt here from chapter 6 and 7. It came to pass when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and good daughters. And so you notice we have the children of men. That's familiar. We got these daughters. And then here's where it gets interesting. So this is, in other words, this is clearly drawing on Genesis 6, as we saw, Genesis 6:4. And the angels Here we go. The children of heaven saw and lusted after them, that is, these beautiful daughters, and said to one another, come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men and beget us children. So these women, by these angels, became pregnant, and they bore great giants. Here we go, whose height was 3,000 spans, and they consumed all the acquisitions of men, and the men could no longer sustain them. The giants turned against them, devoured mankind, and there's all kinds of stuff, by the way, in 1 Enoch 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, they get into all the different ways that these angels and their offspring, the giants, corrupted mankind, and that ultimately does in 1 Enoch lead to the catastrophic flood and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of lore around these angels and these giants, but you see that there's this direct connection that these angels, through these daughters of men, give birth to giants. Well, First Enoch is the earliest interpretation of First Enoch is this book known as Jubilees, sometimes called a Little Genesis because it's essentially a retelling of the Genesis narrative. And by the way, First Enoch, the first book, and Jubilees are pre-Christian. We have evidence from them much earlier than the New Testament. And Jubilees is basically going to take the ball and run with it. And so it's quite a similar idea. It came to pass when the children of men began to multiply on the face of the earth. Daughters were born unto them, so we've seen that. So you got the children of men and the daughters. And the angels of God looked upon them. So we got the angels again, and Jubilees is all about the different cycles of history and 50-year periods and this Jubilee, and they were beautiful to look upon. They took themselves wives of all they chose, and they bore unto them sons, and they were giants. There we go again. So the angels get together with human daughters and produce giants. And then you have everything fall apart, lawlessness increases, et cetera, and once again you have the flood. So Jubilees, which by the way some fragments were found at Qumran as well as a First Enoch, is an interpretation of First Enoch, an elaboration. But what's interesting about Jubilees is that it is essentially a chapter-by-chapter discussion of Genesis, and this is its interpretation of Genesis 6 in particular. Now let's go forward a bit. I've mentioned Qumran. Qumran not only has fragments of First Enoch as well as Jubilees, but some other writings interweave this exact same ideology. Because the people who were there, living there on the sort of western side of the Dead Sea, the Qumran settlement, had read their First Enoch, had read their Jubilees, they had read Genesis 6, and this is just a few examples of some other fragments that mention this whole myth. So one apocryphon of Genesis says this, behold, then I thought in my heart that the conception of these offspring was the work of the watchers. And so the watchers are these angels. The term watcher actually comes from Daniel. And the pregnancy of the holy ones, that is the holy daughters, and it belonged to the Nephilim. So here we go. They make the connection between the Nephilim and the giants who are the offspring of the heavenly watchers or angels and the holy women of earth. 4Q203, then he punished, not us, but Azazel, and don't have time to get into him, but he's one of the fallen angels, and made him. It's very fragmentary, but here we have these sons of watchers who are the giants. In other words, the watchers give birth to these giants. And then the covenant of Damascus, or Damascus document in column 2, having walked in the stubbornness of the hearts, the watchers of the heavens, these are these angels, they fell. So there we have the idea. It's one of the earliest indications of this, by the way, that angels in heaven, who are called watchers, fell. And it's somehow related to this issue, which is the production of these sons whose height was like that of cedars. In other words, there's some connection between these watchers who impregnate women on earth, produce these Nephilim or these giants, and that's the result of their fall, and it leads to the flood, something along those lines. Now, this all may sound fantastical, but some of the church fathers actually believed this whole idea. The earliest Christian that we can confirm, at least, that bought into this watchers theory was indeed Justin Martyr in the mid-2nd century. So here's his explanation in the second apology he wrote. But the angels, there we go, they transgressed, so there's a fall here, and they were mixing with women, and they gave birth to children who are called demons. Now, this is really interesting. The Nephilim, which elsewhere are giants, are now called demons by the church, at least this particular church father. And they're all the offspring of these fallen angels who are intermixing with women. So according to Justin Martyr, demons on earth are actually the offspring of angels who fell and women on earth. Not to be outdone, Clement of Alexandria also holds to a form of this. He refers to the angels who renounced the beauty of God for a beauty which fades and fell from earth. This beauty which fades is probably these women on earth. And then Athenagoras says these angels fell into the impure love of virgins on earth. They were subjugated by the flesh. They became negligent and wicked in the management of these things. And of these lovers of virgins were begotten those who are called giants. So he is familiar with the Septuagint form, because he's writing in Greek here, of Genesis 6. So some of the church fathers, at least, did hold to a form of this mythology. Now, quite famously in the modern day, the Nephilim / Watchers / Giants have not gone away. In the movie Noah, starring Russell Crowe and Jennifer Connelly, quite famously takes Genesis 6 through 9, and in my opinion, actually does a decent job with some of the source material from the Masoretic text. I like the way the flood is depicted and so forth, but they took a lot of heat because they interwove these watchers who are fallen angels who get essentially captured in rock and become these giant people who help Noah, or at least there's some good ones who help Noah. So pretty interesting that you still see this watchers lore play out even today. So one of the big questions is whether this whole theory underlies the New Testament. In two different passages, there is a lot of question marks about whether this idea is being reflected. 2 Peter 2, 4 through 5. If God did not spare angels when they sinned, so the question is, what's their sin here? But cast them into hell and committed them to the chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, so there's some sort of sequence here of this fall of angels with the flood, a herald of righteousness with 7 others when he brought the flood upon the world of the ungodly, and so on and so forth. And so the question is, wait a second, I see a combination of angels who fell and Noah and the flood, which seems like the pattern that you see like in 1 Enoch and Jubilees and so forth. Or in Jude 1, verse 6, the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, some sort of fall from heaven. God has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. So both of these passages are subject to some debate about whether they do, in some sense, subtly refer to the Watchers theory, although, of course, that's not the only explanation. So stepping back then, in summary, the basic idea behind the Watchers theory of Genesis 6:4 is that you have these angels in heaven who are called watchers, but that's drawn elsewhere, most likely from Daniel. They're not called watchers in the book of Genesis. They were attracted to earthly women. They fell. They produced offspring with these women that are called either Nephilim or giants. And the sin and interaction between these Nephilim and the rest of humanity is what helps precipitate the flood. So that's, in a nutshell, what the Watchers theory is. Well, what about the alternative? And I'll be a bit briefer here, the offspring theory, which again, that's maybe not the normal term for it. I'm not sure if there is a label for it. But the basic premise is this, that actually what you have in Genesis 6:4, the second half in particular, where you have the sons of God and the daughters of men, is a reference to the sons of Seth. He is the righteous offspring of Adam and Eve. We see that in Genesis 4:26. I mentioned that way back in that particular video. They were tempted by the daughters of Cain. The daughters of men were the daughters of Cain, the non-righteous offspring. They intermarry, and they bear children that are cursed in some way, although it's unclear in Genesis, of course, what the problem is. But it was something that violates the statute of God, that essentially in the line of Seth is where the righteous sperma or zera is supposed to be found, not Cain. And the Nephilim then, who result from this, could just be fallen ones or just mighty warriors. They're not necessarily gigantic people, although that is a point of debate among those who hold this view. This basic idea ultimately actually becomes the standard Jewish interpretation, where they move away from the Watchers theory in the 2nd and 3rd century AD and adopt this theory. It's also a view that is held by other church fathers. And I'm just going to give you one example. Augustine here in the City of God basically says, look, the Watchers theory is just made up. He adopts this Seth versus Cain theory, and this is what he says about it. Let us omit then the fables of those scriptures which are called apocryphal because of their obscure origin. It was unknown to the fathers from whom the authority of the true scripture, so notice this is partly a scriptural question as to what is our source of authority, has been transmitted to us by the most certain and well ascertained succession. which, by the way, gives us good insight into Augustine's view of how we know that there is a canon. He says it's just been passed on to us. No one picked it. It's already there. But that's a story for a different day. For though there is some truth in these apocryphal writings, he admits that, look, they're not entirely completely wrong. They still do contain some false statements, so that the writings which are produced under his name, and he's talking about Enoch here, and which contain these fables about the giants, there we go, are properly judged by prudent men to be not genuine. Now, the reason why he talks about first Enoch is that he admits that Jude does indeed use that book. So it must have some truth in it. But he says, look, the giant stuff and the angels, that's not true. And most smart people, I guess excluding Justin Martyr and Athenagoras and so forth, don't believe it. Instead, he says this, and it gets interesting. He does actually think there are giants, such as Goliath or something like that. But there were giants even before the flood. And these were the citizens of the earthly society of men, that the sons of God, who are according to the sons of Seth, according to the flesh, sunk into this community when they forsook righteousness, namely with the daughters in the line of Cain. And so he says that explains what's going on. For some reason, he is still convinced that they are indeed gigantic. Why that would be the case, I don't know, but this is his view as he's moving away, and other church fathers, Chrysostom and some others do the same thing. They move away from the Watchers theory. So pretty interesting stuff. Hopefully this has been fun. Just to give you a bit of a background on the Watchers theory of Genesis 6:4 versus the offspring of Seth versus the offspring of Cain theory, as we understand who exactly these giants are when we find them in the Septuagint. So hopefully you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching.